Hello, my name is Brooklyn Walker, and this is my presentation over the different disability characteristics that we went over in educating exceptional students. So, the first disability that we went over were SLP disorders, and one in specific was a speech disorder. So, this disorder includes the different producing sounds as well as disorders of voice qualities and fluency of speech. So, this also would pertain to articulation problems and just stuttering and things like that. So also at the end of each of my slides, I included the universal design for learning criteria that can be helped to meet the student's needs. This specific one I chose 5.3, and it talks about building fluencies with graduated levels of support for practice and performance, which would help the students in speaking and the way that they articulate their words. The next disorder that we covered was dyslexia, and some signs of dyslexia would be the swapping of letters, numbers, or symbols. And students who have dyslexia normally tend to struggle with reading, spelling, and writing. The next disorder we covered was a math disability, and in particular, we talked about dyscalculia. And in dyscalculia, students, kind of like dyslexia, but more just narrow towards mathematics, they tend to not grasp the concept of number sense, or they switch their numbers around. So the universal design for learning that I chose to use for this specific disorder would be to support decoding of text, mathematical notation, and symbols. Next, we talked about memory disorder, and this specific disability can be divided into two different groups, which would be short-term memory and long-term memory. So depending on the student, they could maybe read something and then completely forget what they just learned or read, and then it might come back to them at a later time, whereas long-term would mean that they read it once and they probably won't remember it for a long period of time. And then the UDL that I chose for this was to facilitate managing information and resources, which would help students if they're in the correct facility. Maybe there's a specific way that helps them remember, and we can help them with that. The next type of disorder would be an emotional disturbance, and a child who is emotionally disturbed normally tends to act out either emotionally and in the classroom or just showing their work. It's hard for them to build relationships. They might often have inappropriate actions. And it also says that they tend to be hypochondriacs, which means they think that they're sick all the time or hurt, and they're actually not. And one interesting thing that I remember learning was that students actually can um, convince themselves that they are sick, which actually might make them sick. So that is definitely one way to tell if a child is emotionally disturbed. The next would be a behavioral disorder, and this kind of is divided into two groups, so an external and internal. So an externally behavioral disturbed child would be disruptive, maybe annoying to others in the classroom or the teacher themselves, non-compliant, and an example would be bullying. So a student who maybe might take their anger out on another child or something like that. And then internal would be that a child has withdrawal or they just show no emotion. They might show signs of depression, anxiety, and be fearful of other things. And an example of this would be suicide. The next disorder that we covered was a social and emotional disability, and that included anxiety. So some symptoms of anxiety would be a student who goes into panic mode all the time and is freaking out over things, has separation problems from parents or friends, and then has odd phobias, or they're just scared of things. The UDL that I decided to use for this was 9.2, and that is listed below. The next social emotional disability would be a mood disorder, and this can include like bipolar disorder, bipolar depression, and things like that. And some symptoms would be hopelessness and disruptiveness. So within the classroom, they may be happy one second and then just angry and taking their anger out on a student the next. Um, and then the UDL that I decided to use was 7.3, which states minimizing threats and distractions. So within a classroom, if you have a student who has a mood disorder, you could just minimize their resources maybe, and then try to find things that keep them focused on their work instead of lashing out on others. Oppositional defiant disorder, which is also known as ODD. It's also a social emotional disability, and it can pertain to children having frequent tantrums, which just means acting out randomly and getting really angry, and then annoying and upsetting others. And they also tend to be really touchy. They always want to be up in everybody's business or talking to somebody all the time, and they're easily annoyed by others, so they could also maybe go up and try to spark a conversation and then just be like, why are you talking to me the next? And then the UDL that I decided to use for this was to optimize access to tools and assistive technologies. So a student who is acting out and can't get along with anybody in the classroom, there's other options for them, and they can maybe have their own section of the room that they just go to whenever they feel like acting out. Next was a conduct disorder, and this also is a socially emotional disability, and some characteristics include aggressive behavior, destructive behavior, being deceitful, and then they always want to violate the rules, so they're the rule breakers. And these children who tend to just be angry all the time, they may have a conduct disorder, and a way to help that is to guide and make an appropriate goal setting. So maybe telling the student, hey, maybe you should give some compliments today instead of yelling and being angry. The next disability that we covered was schizophrenia. And schizophrenia is a really rare disorder, but it is present in pretty much every school. And students who have schizophrenia tend to maybe have an imaginary friend or two who believe that they're like actually there. So that would be like a delusion or hallucinations of just seeing things or thinking that something is on them and it's not. And then these students also tend to be very high energy and off the walls, and then one second they'll be tired and not wanting to talk to anybody. So the universal design for learning that could help incorporate into the classroom for students with schizophrenia would be minimizing threats and distractions. So maybe making sure that they're on task all the time and have a strict schedule, just so they don't act out in the classroom. Next is ADHD, and this is probably one of the more common things that we see in classrooms today, and it includes students who tend to be hyper, always on the go, want to move, and are easily distracted. And there's different ways that students can get distracted, whereas they could either be, tapping a pencil all the time, always having to move around, and then maybe when you're getting a lesson, all they want to do is draw on their paper or be talking to somebody, and it tends to cause a lot of distractions within the classroom. So this obviously does cause problems, and a routine is a good way to help change the students' ways. And there are medications that students can be given, but that is not something that's up to a teacher. So yes, the UDL that I decided to attach to ADHD was to provide options for physical action. So this would include maybe having a little break in between classes so students can move around and get their jitters out. Okay, the next is ADD, and this type of student who might have this disorder would make careless mistakes. They would struggle to organize, maybe they're always off task and can't get their homework in on time, even though they know that it's due, they just don't find time to do it. And then I said to facilitate managing information and resources. And I definitely believe that if there's somebody there to help manage their organization skills and the way that they do what they're doing in class, they can help improve their symptoms. The next disorder is an intellectual disability, actually, and it is an adaptive disorder. So, students who have an adaptive disorder seem to be responsible, but they have low self esteem and they're kind of extroverts, so they don't really want to they're introverts, so they don't really want to go out and make friends, and they really like to follow the rules. So, how to help a student who might have an adaptive disorder, who shows gullibility and just like extreme rule following, would be to provide expectations and belief that optimize motivation. So, just simply motivating the student and helping them succeed, and maybe trying to allow them to branch out would help. Okay, so Down syndrome is also an intellectual disability, and this disability includes when students have an extra chromosome, and some physical differences are noticeable. They have smaller eyes, their mouths seem to be mush-mouthed, and they don't speak as well as others. But some other characteristics include hearing loss, heart problems, and vision impairment, since they do have such small eyes. And then they have low intellectual abilities. So when they grow up, they don't tend to learn more than normally a third grade level. So I think that doing some goal setting for these students would definitely be sufficient, and it would help them to stay on task and just fit in within the classroom. The next disability is autism, and this is also an intellectual disability. And students who have autism, they can either be highly intelligent or maybe really have a low grade level intake. But some characteristics include strange phobias. They might be really attached to one specific thing, or like a different type of characteristic, or like action toys, just anything. And then they kind of seem to be socially awkward. They don't branch out much, and they like to have routine. And if they get out of that routine, then they normally seem to lash out. So I chose to use minimal threats and distractions within the classroom, just so these students don't feel threatened by anybody or anything, and then just keeping them on task can help them to improve in the classroom. The next is deafness, and students who are deaf, there are different ways to tell. They might always sit at the front of the class because they can't hear where they're at, or they might just kind of seem to be delayed on actions. Like if you speak with them, it might take them a moment to reply, and then they have kind of trouble retaining information because they might not be able to hear. And sometimes in the younger grades, it's harder to catch this, but it's definitely an important aspect to be aware of, just because there are a lot of students who do have hearing loss. And it's important to offer alternate visual information so the student's able to see things instead of hear. The next is traumatic brain injuries, and this includes maybe a student's in a car accident or just has a really fatal accident, and it can include memory loss, the lack of fine motor skills that they used to have, or maybe slurred speech. And it's important to be aware of these, just because students can go downhill if it's not caught right off the bat. So what I chose to look forward to in the Universal Design for Learning was to offer ways of customizing the display of information. So if a student needs help, just morph it to their abilities and help them to learn. Then there's blindness, and some characteristics are students who are already blind and have to use a walking stick, or maybe have a dog with them. But a way to tell if a student can't see in the classroom and hasn't been diagnosed is they're always squinting. They might sit at the front of the class and they have a hard time reading out loud because they cannot read the content. And offering alternative information for visuals and using maybe more auditory learning for them is a good way to incorporate that in the classroom. And then the last disability, which this isn't really a disability, it's just one of the different things that we covered in class was giftedness, and a child who's gifted excels in a specific area, and they may seem to be bored with class and they're always done and before time and are just kind of sitting there. And a way to help students who are gifted is to vary demands and resources to optimize challenge. So always challenge your students and keep them always trying to learn more and better themselves. So that's a wrap on my presentation over the disabilities for educating exceptional students.